This is a WDBJ7 special presentation. Black History, Voices of Virginia. Sponsored by Member One Federal Credit Union.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tanisha Jackson.
And I'm Michaela Shelton, and you're watching WDBJ7's Black History Special, Voices of Virginia, the special where we're highlighting and celebrating Black history and culture in our hometowns.
Now, Virginia has the longest continuous experience with African American life in the country, starting as far back as 1619, where the first African slaves were brought to the shores of Jamestown. Their arrival marked the start of a long, unimaginable journey, and Roanoke plays a part in that history.
So in this special, we'll take a deeper look into that history with our first story as WDBJ7's Patsy Montesinos weaves the tale of Virginia Lee, a local literary hero working behind the scenes. She fought to build the Gainsborough Library and collect Black history books in the face of adversity. This library has been a safe place for the people in the Gainsborough community for over 80 years. But this building and some of the books inside it would not be here if it wasn't for the bravery of one woman. Virginia Y. Lee became a Gainsborough librarian in 1928.
You can't mention the Gainsborough Branch Library without mentioning Mrs. Lee's name.
Carla Lewis started working in the library a year after Lee retired in 1971. Wanting to follow in her footsteps, Lewis interviewed Lee twice. That's where she learned the library used to be housed in the basement of the YMCA.
She said it was a lot of rain, sometimes the books would get wet.
Lee petitioned Roanoke City to build an actual library for the community. Officials gave $20,000 for the project. Lee knew that wasn't enough money, so she asked nearby St. Andrew's Catholic Church for some of their land.
Well, I don't know whether it got to the Pope or not, but she said the answer was yes.
In 1942, the new Gainsborough Library officially opened its doors in the midst of segregation.
We couldn't use the regular libraries, we could use this one, and it became just an important part of our community.
It was a safe place for children like Earl Reynolds, who grew up visiting every day in the 1950s.
She would open up visions and ideas that helped you to believe in yourself.
She taught them about respect, personal hygiene, and college.
There were kids like me who needed the opportunity to explore and to dream about what the future could be like.
Lee was driven to make sure Black children had the same tools as every other child in the city, and to do that, she had to take risks and defy city officials.
She was almost fired for that, for ordering the books. Biographies, autobiographies, nonfiction materials pertaining to Blacks.
In a daring move, Lee continued to expand the Black history collection. She partnered with community leaders, reaching out nationwide for donations, creating the biggest collection of Black history in Southwest Virginia.
She was told by city officials not just to slow the pace of her collecting, but to get rid of the Black history collection.
They demanded the removal of the books as the civil rights movement was starting to gain momentum.
She took it to the library's basement and hid it there, and then would provide secret access to the books when people needed them.
Historian and University of Delaware professor Laura Helton is writing a book about Black women in the South who preserved history. An entire chapter is dedicated to Lee.
Her story is about another moment when there were folks who didn't think that this history should be accessible. Her story is a model for us to really think about and hold up in our own moment.
Every time we had an activity or a celebration, the neighborhood people came out.
Lewis worked to honor Lee by renaming the collection to the Virginia Y. Lee African American History Collection.
She wanted to create something important for Black people.
1982, Lee attended the ceremony and shared her story.
And I'm sure in the not too far distant future, you will be reading about, you will be hearing about the Black collections at Gainsborough Branch Library.
Lee passed away in 1992, but her courage continues to live on inside the Gainsborough Library.
Reporting in Roanoke, Patsy Montesinos, WDBJ7.
We're now sitting down with renowned historian, community member, and advocate Jordan Bell. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are deeply interested in local history, and in fact, you actually started a historical tour called Gainsborough Revisited. So kind of tell us why that sparked your interest.
So the walking tour came from me listening to my grandmother and my aunt and my mother and her friends telling stories of the old neighborhood, listening to a gentleman by the name of Richard Chubb. And then I wanted to get my daughter interested in it. She was about 7 or 8 at that time, and she didn't want to go to the library or read any books. So I said, why don't you walk around the neighborhood with me? And she agreed to that. And so that is how the walking tours sort of got started. And then it's grown into something that's just a phenomenal thing.
Yeah, and the Gainsborough Historic District actually got put on the National Register for Historic Places. Talk about a little bit about the significance of that in our history.
So when a neighborhood is designated as a historic district, it has certain rights that homeowners and property owners have to oblige by, but also it gives certain resources to those neighborhoods. And so we're grateful that the Gainsborough neighborhood is on the historical registry because it saves institutions such as the Gainsborough Library, the Dumas Center, and different buildings like that when a neighborhood is on the historical registry.
And from your perspective and knowledge, where do you see African American history being celebrated and talked about for generations to come?
I see it growing due to social media. Everybody has access to history now. And so I actually see it growing, even though throughout the country it looks like things are being taken away and banned. I actually see the telling of Black history, especially local history, growing.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, sharing a little bit of the Gainsborough history with us, especially because you are born and raised there. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Coming up next on our Voices of Virginia special, Joe DeShiel is taking us to the Old Lake Cemetery.
Welcome back. At this time, we'd like to share a poetry reading from a Pushcart Prize-nominated poet. Take a listen.
My name is Eva Lynch Comer. I am a student at Hollins University, and the title of this poem is Because I Am a Black Woman. They tell me to clench my soul in place. Instead, I twirl in subways, arms outstretched, and let my hips sway. They wield the wind like a whip and teach me how to starve my breath. Instead, I lie in grass while the breeze braids dandelion fuzz into my hair. They show me how to gouge the vines of my veins from the black trunks of my wrists. Instead, I scoop my spiraling soul into the hearts of my palms and lean forward so my tears can rinse my hands.
And that was Eva Lynch Comer reading Because I Am a Black Woman. You can find out more about her on our website. In our next story, we visit an African American cemetery in the city of Roanoke, where volunteers are reclaiming a sacred space and revealing more of the hidden history. Here is senior reporter Joe DeShiel.
More than 30,000 cars pass Old Lick Cemetery every day. But for decades, the wooded hillside near Interstate 581 was a mystery to many in Western Virginia. Darnell Wood grew up nearby.
And I had walked by this cemetery many times in my youth, coming from the Lincoln Terrace area, going to the old Sears and Roebuck. Never knew African Americans were buried here. All I saw was a dilapidated cemetery that needed cleaning up.
Today, that dilapidated cemetery that needed cleaning up is getting the attention it deserves. One Saturday a month, weather permitting, dedicated volunteers fan out across the property to reclaim the headstones and the history they represent from the bushes, trees, and vines that had overtaken the cemetery.
Can I ask you what it's like working in this thicket?
Well, for the most part, it's not too bad, except when you run into these with the nice little thorns on them.
Last spring, we found Matt Elliott in a tangle of vines, but he told us the work has been satisfying.
when I first started, it was clear over the other side where this is all bare ground now. This is all stuff that I've been a part of help clearing. So to me, that's pretty awesome.
So like there's stones all through this thicket, right?
Yes.
Ellen Stick was an educator with Roanoke City Public Schools in 2019 when she envisioned a project to get social studies teachers involved in the community. With each visit, the Friends of Old Lick Cemetery reveal more of the memorials, and every headstone has a story.
We actually have a photograph of Ellen Banks. Her lifespan began at the culmination of the Civil War and carried through World War II. So as a teacher, and I'm always a teacher, there's a lot to discuss.
And the history doesn't end at the hillside overlooking the interstate.
These cars are the first to move along a newly opened section of Interstate Spur 581.
A portion of the cemetery owned by the city of Roanoke stood in the way of Interstate 581. More than 900 graves were moved to the city cemetery at Coiner Springs. Joe Cobb was attending a memorial service there 20 years ago when he first saw a stone monument marking the area where the remains were relocated.
And that really was mysterious to me and intriguing.
Now Roanoke's Vice Mayor, Cobb recently completed his doctoral dissertation honoring their breaths that focuses on the connection between the two cemeteries.
And I began to imagine the stories of the people who were buried here and the stones that had been consumed by nature, and what would it be like to begin to uncover those stories and to breathe new life into them.
Today the work continues at Old Lick Cemetery. Soon there will be a sign with a brief history and links to online resources where people can learn more. Plans for a more accessible trail are taking shape. A fundraising campaign will pay for new fencing, and there's hope that one day a small parking lot will help people access the area. Darnell Wood says it's important work.
But we need to keep this part of Roanoke alive, keep the history alive, and let people know.
In Roanoke, Joe DeShiel, WDBJ7.
Well, fascinating story there. Coming up on WDBJ7's Black History Month special, Voices of Virginia, we're taking our journey to Bedford, Virginia, and how one couple is trying to preserve our history.
Welcome back to our Voices of Virginia special. We move now to Central Virginia, an area with history that spreads over centuries. I take a deep dive into Bedford County, where a slave dwelling is still holding strong, and why one couple is working to preserve it. On what's now 17 acres of land in Bedford County sits a structure with so much history to tell. A slave dwelling made of wood that's still standing shy of 200 years.
It's a double pen style dwelling. One part of it was built in the 18-teens, and then the second part was actually built in the 1830s. Most slave structures are no longer standing or surviving in the state just due to the nature of their construction. They weren't meant to be long-standing buildings or to last lifetimes or multiple generations. They're meant to be ephemeral, to be moved, to leave very little impact on the ground.
The owners of the former plantation known as Ivy Cliff, Sophie and Mike Taylor, didn't want to be on camera, but say they bought the land in 2021. After learning about the slave dwelling behind their house, they began work to preserve the structure. And in 2022, it made Preservation Virginia's most endangered historic places list.
Fewer than 100 that are left, and if you think about, there were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these structures built. They're just the few last vestiges, physical built vestiges of slavery in Virginia, so it's very important.
Randy Lichtenberger and Jessica Gansert are archaeologists in the Lynchburg area.
This was the main living, cooking area for the family that would have lived in here.
After conducting excavation work on the land, it's believed 4 slave dwellings were once standing side by side. Up to 12 slaves could have lived in each dwelling at a time.
Slave dwellings, most of the time, were actually built by the enslaved people that would have gone on to live in there. So they would have been sent to build them wherever their work was.
Inside the structure, architectural remains have been found that include symbols of African religion.
Most of the people that were brought over from Africa were of 3 ethnic groups, Yoruba, Igbo, or Kanga. All 3 shared a similar belief in the god of ironworking. And so having iron nails that are hand wrought, and especially in the pattern of 3 with X's and 3 rows of X's, That really is a powerful symbol of hoodoo to keep away bad spirits and people who wish harm on those who are living inside.
Walking through the dwelling, Jessica points out a valuable treasure uncovered beneath the dust.
What we can see here that has survived in our hearth is the name James with a backwards J. So that shows us that somebody who was living here not only knew how to spell, but they could write, and they wrote their own name here. This is really significant. This gives us the name of somebody that was living in here.
I think we're in a period of time now where there's this interest in erasing history. I think being able to research Ivy Cliff gives us an opportunity to learn about a fuller history.
The Taylors have a goal of opening the dwelling to the public for educational purposes. They continue to apply for funding that will allow the team to dig up the past.
And we wanted to do an excavation to find a potential subfloor pit. A subfloor pit is similar to a root cellar. It's a pit for storage underneath the floor, and it was used by enslaved individuals to keep personal artifacts, personal items. So if we get that grant in, we'll be able to crawl underneath these floorboards here and find something that'll tell us even more about the daily life of the enslaved people that lived here.
Their untold stories are now being given a voice.
Ivy Cliff will not be forgotten.
In Bedford County, Tanisha Jackson, WDBJ7. And we'll be back with more Black History Month, Voices of Virginia, after this quick break.
Hello, I'm T.J. Anderson III, professor at Hollins University, and this poem is called Pretty Boy. I was the anointed one held up by a line of lunch ladies who raised their industrial spatulas and soup spoons, announcing the arrival of Pretty Boy. And I sauntered in my tater-tot kingdom, resplendent in khakis and school books. Prince of milk cartons and tomato-crowned meatloaf, sovereign of stainless railings we ran our trays through. I fancied myself the envy of pigtailed girls and dungaree-wearing boys. Bouffanted in polyester teachers craned for a glimpse of me in their jeweled eye frames, witness to the presence of such genius that would call them to genuflect and all to go blind. Yes, I was Pretty Boy, the elementary destroyer, the golden child, ignorant to the years that would eventually come to wither away my magisterial beauty.
Powerful. To check out more of T.J. Anderson's work, you can visit our website, and we'll be back with more Black History Month content after the break. Well, we've come to the end of this half hour, but that doesn't mean Black history and the voices of our hometown end here.
Exactly. So tell us about your favorite hometown Black history stories on our Facebook page. Thanks again for watching. We'll continue our Voices of Virginia special at 6:30 on WDBJ 24.
Thank you for watching Black History, Voices of Virginia, sponsored by Member One Federal Credit Union.